But yeah, we can get things underway. We have a lot of ground to cover today, and we only have an hour. So first of all, I'm Kurt Gutjahr. I'm the managing director at the Center of the American West, and welcome to the very first in our series, Historians Imagine, celebrating creativity in the craft, featuring Ari Kelman. We're very happy to have Ari here today. This monthly webinar features conversations with groundbreaking historians about inventiveness and vision of their work. As I mentioned before, we are recording this webinar, so it will be available on our website in about a week's time. So www.centerwest.org. A special shout out. This series came about as the result of the vision and drive of Kate Carpenter, a Princeton graduate student who came to us after Patty and Matt participated in a session at the Western History Association and prodded us into creating a monthly series about creativity in the craft. And so thank you, Kate, so much. This event and this series would not exist without your prodding. So we really appreciate it. I also want to give a shout out to all the people who contributed and put in a lot of work on the back end on this. Honey Aschenbrenner, who has coordinated our outreach campaign. Lisa Cooper, who's actually a little host in the back there. She will be doing a little marionette stuff here in just a minute. Valerie Albecker, our Mellon coordinator for our Mellon program. And then our great student support staff, Quinn Precourt, Kevin Truong, and Kelly Truong. And then of course, Brian Bishop. He is we call him our tech guy for the webinar. Thank you all. It's a joy working with you all the time. You do an amazing job, a professional job. And it's made this whole thing a pleasure. I just want to have everybody put on their radar the next events that are coming up in this series. So on March 10th, we'll have B. Aaron Cole from the Minnesota Historical Society. April 15th, Jenny Price from Washington University. May 12th, Phil Deloria from Harvard. And June 9th, Natalia Molina from USC. So you can register for those now. So put them on your calendars. You've got plenty of time. In addition, the center also has a number of upcoming events that I just want to highlight. You can find these on our website and registration links on our website for them. The first one is an event coming up on February 25th that's co-sponsored with the law firm Hutchison, Black and Cook, LLC, and it's called The Roots of Today's Racial Exclusion in Boulder County and the Road Ahead. It'll be a fantastic panel discussion. I really urge people to participate. And then we have a series of conversations with CU veteran students called Memories of Service, Visions for the Future, CU student veterans as key figures in sustaining the mission of higher education. This has come out of Patty's sustained and long relationship with the CU Veterans Department or program. And so on Friday, the 26th, she'll be in conversation with two students, Nisa Cerna and Reed Robbins. And on Friday, March 5th, she'll be in conversation with the two other students, Zach Giuliano and Bob Drahan. The registration for this is not yet available on our website, but will by the end of the week, just so you're aware. Then we have a What It Means to Disagree Part 2. It's a conversation more conversation, and maybe potentially more disagreement between Patty Limerick and the University of Colorado Center for Humanities and Arts Director Jennifer Ho. It's a second in a series. They started this conversation just after the election in November, and it was particularly well intended. It explores a range of areas on disagreement, so please come to that. And then hot off the presses, about 10 minutes ago, I just got an email that we will be planning a additional event in our Bipartisanship and Friendship Happen series. This will feature the University of Colorado President Kennedy and University of Massachusetts Presidents Marty Meehan. They were actually they both served in Congress together. Kennedy is a Republican and Meehan is a Democrat. So it will be an opportunity to have their explore issues around higher education during the pandemic, but also talk about their friendship and how they've learned to work together. And so, as you all know, go to our website to register for all of this. And then just a couple housekeeping notes. So in the spirit of creativity, we're doing something we've never done before, which is have a Q&A session in a separate Zoom room where people can come and actually speak and raise their hands, just like you're in a regular Zoom meeting, which I'm sure many of us have been in. And so right now we're going to post in the Q&A a link to that Zoom room. So those of you who would like to join us at 1 o'clock when this event ends, please copy that link, pull it to the side, copy it. So as you'll notice, Brian Bishop is saying, what is the Zoom link for the Q&A portion of this event? And Lisa is answering that question. So you look at the answers and you will see the Zoom link there. We will reiterate this a few times during the course of the event. So please reserve your questions for that unless you can't be there and you feel like you need to, you want to put up a question that we could consider at a later point. We will record all these questions, keep them on hand, and they will inform us as we develop this series moving forward. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Matt Jacobson, who will take it from here. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Kurt. Thanks everyone for coming. Thank you for taking some time away from season 2 of impeachment. This is kind of a homecoming for me of sorts. I grew up in Boulder, Colorado, so I'm here in New Haven today. But it's warming and lovely to see the CU logo on the top of my screen here. Let me just say a couple of things about historians imagine. Our premise here really is pretty simple, and it is twofold. The first part is that the historian's craft is primarily a kind of an artist's or an artist's pursuit or a creative pursuit. Although we've inherited a language of certainty that we borrow from the sciences mostly and empiricism, and our language of certainty tends to mask the creativity of the project. But when we're at our best, we're asking creative questions. We're coming up with creative solutions to our problems. We're finding creative ways to read specific sources. We're finding creative ways to find sources. And we're doing creative storytelling. We're making new stories out of old materials. So that's the first premise, is that this is a creative craft, but we too seldom talk about it that way. And the second premise is, when we do talk about it that way, there is much to learn. My own experience in interviewing at this point about 40 or 45 very creative historians, some of whom are on the line today, is that when you pull that dimension forward and ask people to talk about their work in those terms and talk about their process, talk about their methods in terms of creativity, you learn things about their work and you learn things about the craft that you would never know otherwise. And that is why we're here. And with that, I pass it to Patty Limerick.
Thank you, Matt. This is Matt's idea, this creativity approach, and then amplified by Kate Carpenter's thoughts that we should pursue it. So we're very grateful for that, and we're really grateful that our top-ranked team just said they would participate in our first 5 episodes, and we'll just keep going on here. So Ari Kelman, I'm going to just start off. We're going to talk about your book. So if I read a resume introducing you, that seems like idiocy, because we're very soon to hear you speak about them yourself. So I will not be doing that. But Ari Kelman's written some really interesting books, ladies and gentlemen. Just going to say that, and then we'll get back to those. I just want to ask you, this is a really goofy question, but were you surprised to get this invitation, Ari?
Yeah, I was totally surprised. I'm always surprised when people invite me to things. I'm totally uncool. Why would anyone want me to be part of anything they're doing?
Okay, so I guess my follow-up question would be, did you have any inclination to think that or should I think that you've been waiting all your life for this invitation to speak about creativity? Apparently, well, we'll just find that out. Waiting all your life?
I mean, so there's sort of 2 ways to answer that. One is the quick and dirty answer, which is I've thought a lot about the question of ways that historians can imagine themselves as being creative. The slightly longer answer is that I've spent a lot of time in my career thinking about ways that I can spur my own creativity and try and spur others to be creative. And so hearing Matt talk about the discipline in the way that he just did lights me up, right? I mean, I have a lot of conversations, particularly with graduate students, but often with colleagues as well, about the way in which we make choices and in the work that we do, and how the choices that we make in the creation of an article or a book or some other kind of cultural artifact are really significant. And that the myth of the work that we do, not to take anything away from Matt said around empiricism, and the Germanic origins of the discipline, but the work that we do has its own kind of myth, and that's that we don't show the scaffolding very often, and we don't reveal the choices that we make very often. That we present a finished product, and I actually, not only am I not taking anything away, but I agree with Matt that it comes out of a particular cultural moment and cultural imperatives around trying to present our work as being, if not scientific, at least trying to lean in that direction. And so people don't have a way of accessing those. Again, I just keep using the same word, but the choices that we make, what we leave on the cutting room floor, what we include, why we make the decision to push an argument in one direction or another, or to pivot from narrative to analysis, or to change registers in our writing or in our spoken presentation.
Right, and not to give too much away either, but the choices you have made are quite extraordinary. And the choice that you made with your first book of having an overwhelming, absolutely overwhelming set of choices of sources you could go look at, and how you made those choices, down to your most recent book where you chose to work with an illustrator in a graphic history, which is a choice I am never going to, I can tell you that. That just is so, but I'm so glad you did. So we'll get to that. But boy, choice making, have we ever got a festival of that ahead of us. So I want to ask you what you call yourself. You have so many options: environmental historian, urban historian, historian of Indians, cultural historian. Do you happen to know the answer to what you are?
No. I mean, these days, I'm embarrassed to say I call myself interim dean, which is, probably the least flattering self-description I can imagine. I have taken note of the fact that throughout my career, I have played different roles in different sub-disciplines. There was a time when a lot of people thought of me as an environmental historian, and exclusively as an environmental historian. But at that same time, I subsequently learned that there were a number of people who thought of me as an urbanist. I didn't think of myself as being strictly either of those things. A few years ago, when I wrote my book about the Sand Creek Massacre, and the book did well, I went to some of the award ceremonies at which I was feted. And that was FETED, not FETID, though maybe the latter as well. And people kept saying to me what an extraordinary work of public history it was. And I subsequently got involved with National Council of Public History, but I always say to people, and I guess this is how I define myself, is that I don't feel comfortable. There are very, very few places where I feel genuinely comfortable as a scholar. And I don't feel comfortable describing myself as a public historian, because there are so many public historians out there who are doing better and more engaged work than I've done. And I feel like if I call myself a public historian, it's in some ways a kind of cultural appropriation. The same is true of almost all of the sub-disciplines of which I am nominally part. I suppose I think of myself these days as being a Western historian. I think that's the water in which I am most comfortable swimming at this point. And so that's probably where either that or a Civil War historian. Those are the two areas in which those Civil War historians blanch when they hear me say that.
We don't know why they're blanching, though. They could have.
No, we do. They tell me in detail why they're blanching.
Well, that's interesting, because the Western history approach is, oh, thank the Lord, you're part of us. This is wonderful. Apparently that is not as normal a stance as, okay. So I have a category for you, which I'd like you to continue, just consider. And I know that there are others who do this, but they're not, okay. I think you're a historian of mortality. And I say that based on a good round of immersion in your work. You convey the immediacy and lasting impact of violent and unforeseen and premature death. And I think that's really important, because I believe that it's pretty common for people who are not in our line of work, and some of the people who are in our line of work, to think of the historical figures as having been dead so long that it doesn't really matter how they died, or if they died, or when they died. We knew they died. So I think that you have an amazing thing going and really lending your vitality to the people of the past and having them as restored to life as they are capable of being, so that they are the grief that can hit when they pass away. I had no idea that that was going to happen to me when I got into your, especially your most recent book, but Yellow Fever, New Orleans and the Necropolis, Sand Creek and the sudden deaths there, battle lines. And as you know, I wrote you probably just to say that some passages in battle lines, I started battle lines graphic novel. I'm going to stop talking very much now here and go to you pretty fast here, but I started thinking, oh, why did he do that? He chose this illustrated form of communication that is inevitably light. It is just inevitably light for a study of such terrible death and suffering. And the result of it now is that I can't look at some of the pages in that book without going down, even though I knew that death, violent death was the story. I knew that. And the methods that you are using just break through. They just break through. So that is the category that I am asking you to consider. We can come back to it at the end and see if you want that or not. But historian of mortality, which I suppose every historian is in some way or another, but the way that you bring the folks back so that we grieve for them, pretty amazing. So, okay, so that sounds like a book jacket blurb or something, but it's really just what I wanted you to have in your mind here as we went on it. So we want you to start off here. This is a question that Matt asks of most of his interviews here. What happened to you? What were the influences, the people, the things, the events that served as your models, but got you to thinking that a historian was something that you wanted to be, and also how that was compatible with your passions, that to take the examples set before you, or the failed examples or whatever, what led you to think, okay, I want to be one of those, and this will be compatible with my passions. And you can choose at what level of discretion and comfort you identify those passions and speaking of them. It's quite a word, passions. It's Matt's word. So, all right, please.
So I'm going to, unfortunately, this is going to be a slightly long answer, and I'm going to ask either you or Matt to jump in at any point that you want me to either pivot to something else or that you'd like me to go into a bit more detail. I wasn't planning to give this kind of a long answer. I anticipated that you'd ask a question like this, and I had something in my mind, but I have to say, Patty, the historian of mortality thing really hit me. I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of the literary trope of the true name. When you say someone's true name, you establish a connection with them, and that people generally don't offer their true name. But so you may, I found myself choking up as you talked about a historian of mortality, and I'm still a little bit verklempt. And so I'm going to give you a more detailed answer than I would have otherwise. So I grew up in a household where my father was the son of first-generation immigrants to the United States. My dad grew up in poverty in Chicago. He never had enough to eat, and he remembered that vividly, and nevertheless raised me in a decidedly middle class setting. I did not grow up without considerable privilege. Nevertheless, I heard a great deal about my father's upbringing on the south side of Chicago. And I heard a great deal about my father's gratitude to the United States for providing a safe harbor for his family. That was part of the context of my upbringing. The other part was that my mom is a Holocaust survivor. She's a child survivor of the Holocaust. And so I grew up with her stories, and more particularly with my grandparents and my great aunt and great uncle, the quartet, my grandfather, grandmother, my great aunt and great uncle, and then my mother, who was born immediately before the beginning of the war, all made a kind of a blood oath that they would either survive or die together. And so I heard their stories of the war and of the Warsaw Ghetto. I didn't register this as having been a particularly important influence in my life, largely because I was a rebellious and obnoxious kid. I still may be to some extent, until I was in graduate school. I didn't register the impact that those stories had had on me until I was in graduate school, already studying to be a historian. I thought much more about Mrs. Stout, my 10th grade AP US history teacher, and Dick Sewell, my undergraduate mentor at the University of Wisconsin. But while I was in grad school, I asked my grandmother if she had her, if she would show me her wedding album, and she laughed and she said, "What makes you think that we have a wedding album? We have nothing. You know, we left Poland with a few dollars and some clothes, and that was it. Everything else is gone." And the absence of material culture was the first time that the reality of my family's experience in the war really hit home for me. And it also crystallized for me the very likely truth that I did gravitate toward history and toward a history of mortality because of so many people who had been lost and so many stories that I had heard around a Shabbat table. Most often a Shabbat dinner table on Friday nights when we would gather and my grandparents would shout at one another in Polish, and I understood very little of what was being said, and I would insist that they should speak in English, and they would sneer at me and wave away, they'd swat away the suggestion that they should speak in English, but my mom would then interpret some of what they were saying. And so I suspect that is where my inspiration to become a historian of mortality came from.
Can I just jump in? I mean, that's so compelling, and an answer I'm sure that neither Patty nor I were expecting, but a deep one, a very deep one. Can you say a little bit about who, given that just kind of deep, grounded interest in history and in recovering stories, who were some of the, either the storytellers of any kind, but maybe historians in particular, who were your models when you first started thinking about how you were going to do this kind of work?
So I was a genuinely atrocious high school student. I only graduated from high school because the assistant principal didn't want me to stick around for another year. I mean, this is a true story. I hadn't fulfilled the graduation requirements because I'd failed a lot of classes. I didn't show up for most of my senior year because I was bored and was busy doing other things. And so but I really did have this experience of having a 10th grade AP US history teacher who cast the teaching of history as an expression of otherwise hidden stories. That was just her understanding of what history was at its best. That it was the act of recovering and sharing stories that otherwise were going to be lost. She was, I later came to realize, a new social historian, right? I mean, she was in a very, very classic expression of that. As I said a few moments ago, I as an undergraduate, my parents were absolutely certain I was going to fail out of the University of Wisconsin. They had me pay my own way because they didn't want to waste their money on this. Which was fair enough. And I took a class my first year. I took a U.S. history survey with Dick Sewell, with Richard Sewell, and it was extraordinary. But it really wasn't until graduate school that I began thinking about and I suppose this is relatively normal, but I didn't start thinking about historiography and the construction of historical narrative. And you know, I'm going to sound like I'm trying to keep Patty from asking me hardball questions, but you know, Patty was one of she's heard me say this before. She was one of the people who inspired me to think about history as, this is going to sound like I'm damning her work with faint praise, but as a particular kind of storytelling where choices get made. Again, I'm just going to keep coming back to that. And then, you know, I had predictable influences. Bill Cronin. When I read Nature's Metropolis, it blew my mind. Richard White, reading Middle Ground and other works of Richard's just absolutely reshaped the way that I understood that you could recount the past. Liz Cohen. Liz continues to be someone whose work I look to quite frequently. Those are probably the early influences, and then as time has passed, I've gravitated toward very, very different kinds of work. Oh, Jean Boydston! I can't believe that I forgot Jean. You know, Jean was the person who, when I was an undergraduate, gave me a sense that it might be possible to be a historian, that could be work that I might do, and she set this example of someone who was at once just an absolutely towering intellect and at the same time completely human. And I didn't see a lot of that as an undergraduate or even in graduate school. And for me, it was a very, very appealing model of a kind of a scholarly life. Yeah, I mean, I can go on. Like any historian, I can talk books forever and ever, but those were the ones that really, that I think were probably most important to me as formative works.
Okay, so speaking of books, we're going to speak of your books, and we're going to move fast through the first, which we don't want to do, but we're going to do that so that we can get all of them in. So I'm going to start us off on the choice issue, because you chose New Orleans as a subject, and I would scare myself if I tried to think what you then faced, since there are several billion topics and approaches for writing about New Orleans, and at least several, an equal number of possibly very valuable sources you should look at. So the fact that you didn't launch into a project of New Orleans and never return is, I mean, that, speaking of choice, good heavens. So, I mean, I actually am frightening myself by saying this, because I'm not young, but I just think, good heavens, what a daunting enterprise with so much. I mean, couldn't you pick a tiny town that had a tiny historical society or something and get going with that? So anyway, so could you walk us through how you took on what is terrifying me? I must stop talking so I can calm down for a moment here, but how did you take on those choices?
So a couple things to say on that. I don't know exactly who's listening to this. I know that there's 140 something people who are here, and then maybe it's going to live on beyond today. So it is important for me to note, in case some of the people listening are graduate students, that my choice was a terrible one. And that trying to write that book as a dissertation was just an absolutely atrocious mistake, and that I had no right to emerge from that error with any sort of career prospects intact. It's too sprawling a book, as you say. It's too complicated a city. And I chose to write something that was way too capacious. I would never ever let one of my own students do this unless they insisted upon it. In which case, I would say, okay, it's your choice. But it was a big mistake.
Can I just speak on your behalf for a second, though? On behalf of your younger self. But if you're going to be wildly ambitious, the dissertation is the time to do it, because life is never going to get easier. You know, if you're an assistant professor scrambling to try to, put the dotted I's and cross the T's on your first book while you're launching a second one, and you're teaching and you're going to committees and you're trying to get some tent stakes into a second project, that second project is probably not going to be as wildly ambitious as the luxury of that first one. So I just want to put in a plug for being really, don't trim your sails as you think about your dissertation.
I think that's a totally valid point, and yet there is also ambition, and then there's youthful indiscretion, right? I mean, it's writing a dissertation book that covers 2+ centuries of history, and that's episodic in a way that makes enormous demands both on the writer and the reader. and that leaves out just an almost immeasurable amount of material, I would argue against it. Though I do think you're right that being I've always been an advocate of ambition in work. And if you've ever seen the letters of recommendation that I write, the ones that are best are ones that talk about a scholar's imagination and ambition. So I'm not disagreeing with you. I just think that you're being too kind defending past Ari. Past Ari was a fool. Present
Well,
Ari is too, but a slightly more measured fool.
so past Ari, though, did come up with this conception of the river and its city, which is so counterintuitive. And it's not just clever. For those of you who haven't read the book, it's not just a clever title. I mean, you were really looking at kind of urban nature in a different way than, and I just would love to hear you talk about, like, how did you get to that conception as a way of managing this too big project?
As ever in my work, and this is something we can talk more about, I came to the principal argument very late in the project. And I only arrived at that argument after having considerable discussion with a lot of people who are much smarter than I am about the work. And it just took me a long time to realize that I was writing about the production of public space, the cultural and the natural production of public space, and the way in which that's a dialectical process. That was not something that I understood early in the project. So, I mean, I can credit, again, we can go back to Bill Cronin. I can credit Bill for having sat down with me and having talked about the project early on. But the problem with speaking to people like Bill is that they think in fully realized arguments. And lesser beings like me, that's just, I blunder my way toward an argument. And eventually, if I'm lucky, I get there. Sometimes I don't. You know, if you were to read some of the things I've written, you'd know that's the case. But you know, the true point of origin of that book is that I in a moment of really profound grief around a variety of different things, I drove from Providence to New Orleans, and I'd never driven into New Orleans before, and I don't know how many people who are here have done that, but I was confronted with the fact that it's an island, and it just made no sense. It was. I think I'm using Pierce Lewis's great geographer. It was an impossible city, and I just found that fascinating and decided that I wanted to write about it. What was it doing there? I mean, it really was a moment of inspiration. And then I went back to Providence and I spoke with Drew Eisenberg, who at the time was at Brown. And Drew absolutely subscribes to your theory of dissertation writing, Matt. He said, you know, environmental history is effectively in its historiographical infancy right now. You can write anything you want. You want to write an environmental history of slavery? Do it. You want to write an environmental history of the Civil War? Do it. You want to write an environmental history of New Orleans, starting at the beginning of the American period and going through the 1970s? Go for it. No one's going to tell you no. And so that was very exciting to me. And it was only in retrospect that I realized how foolish I was.
So because of our constraints on time, there's so much more to discuss with that book, but oh, for heaven's sake, I mean, someone must briefly say that the creativity of the diplomacy involved in writing a book that has unmistakably a message about human beings making choices about placing themselves in a really precarious situation. To write that without going into the, well, you'd think they would have known better, or now look what they've done, and to have the book come out in 2003 and Katrina hit in 2005, and then you add a wonderful preface in 2006. So if you could just speak of that in terms of creativity, of writing as an historian about something that you could be smug and harsh, but you don't have that in you, I understand that, but others do. So how did you hit that pitch of diplomacy?
Yeah, I mean, you're kind to say that I don't have smug and harsh in me. My 13-year-old would totally disagree. He thinks I am nothing but smug and harsh, but that's age appropriate.
It's very smug and harsh of him.
Yeah, exactly. he weighs me daily and finds me wanting. So I don't really want to speak in platitudes, but I'm going to for a moment. I think that the historian's job is to be endlessly empathetic and never sympathetic. I just think that's the gig, right? That we are supposed to, at every turn, practice even sometimes radical empathy, and we are never supposed to be sympathetic with the people who we are writing about. And so when you say, how did I avoid being smug? The answer was, I tried to think very, very hard about how the people in particular moments were making the choices they were making, why they made those choices, given what they knew in the moment. And rather than being sympathetic, I tried again just to be empathetic to the very, very difficult situations that they faced and the choices that they had to make. I mean, some of it is really just a matter of understanding that I make really nothing but mistakes sort of all the time. And so why would I have higher expectations of other people, including historical subjects?
Matt, I'm afraid I may not, we have two more books and we have just, okay, so I'm cutting you off, but I've taken so much time, just really quick.
Okay, just quickly, I think that the craft is just now coming to a moment where we're able to recognize that our own humanity is actually one of our best resources.
Oh.
And I think someone like Saidiya Hartman especially has just really, or Stephanie Smallwood, have just really highlighted that for us. But it's, for our generation, that's like nowhere in our training. But I think you're so right. Like, it is so true to just be able to pull on our own humanity as like a really important resource for the work we do.
Oh, how horrible it would have been if I'd cut you off from that. I would have just spent my life in regret at cutting you off, Matt, because I think that was really important to hear. But I am going to move us to the next book, to A Misplaced Massacre. And that is the winner of the Bancroft Prize. And I wouldn't ever try, the public historian said, you're a public historian, okay, I wouldn't try to name a genre. I wouldn't be able to say, if somebody said, and what form of historical expression does this fall in? I would say, you have half an hour, well, I could help you through the different categories here. So could you, well, speaking of choice making, you had to know, because you did know, that you were choosing a subject of enormous agitation and tension and turmoil. And you had to have, I would think, some reason to know that you would not be just another figure swirling around in that turmoil and tension and conflict. So you had some creative choice of defining the self for how you would be a person. And I should say, for those of you who don't know the book, it is about the Sand Creek Massacre, and Ari visits and watches and chats, and I'm sure dines and hangs out with all the contestants on how the Sand Creek Massacre should be understood, interpreted, and spoken of in our time. So, okay, so that, did you have, I don't think you had pharmaceuticals, but I wouldn't fault you if you did, for how you would manage yourself in that extremely charged territory.
So I want to go back to something that Matt said, and I want to revisit the question of ambition and the way that ambition can frame a project. In this, I am answering your question, Patty. I'm not ducking this. I absolutely understood that Sand Creek was fraught. I understood that I was an outsider. I understood that this was not simply lived history. It wasn't simply living history. It was felt history. I understood that it was that it was history, that it was shaping people's lives, people that I was interacting with. I understood that I was asking people to be enormously generous in speaking with me, that it came at cost for them to talk with me about these issues, that I was asking them to be generous and trusting me to be in rooms where quite frankly, I didn't belong. and where my presence was just another variable that could easily have scuttled an already very complicated set of cultural and social and political dynamics. I knew all of that, and I also knew that I wanted to write a great book. That I wanted to write a book that was worthy of the people who were sharing their time with me, and that was worthy of the memories that they were trying to preserve of people who are no longer alive. And there were a lot of days when it was kind of a crushing burden, and I had a very hard time managing it. It took me a very long time to write the book. I rewrote it entirely 5 times. I leaned more heavily than probably is appropriate on a number of people who helped me with the book, including Thomas Andrews, who's on this line, who read a penultimate draft of the book and said, it's really good, but if you don't in some way acknowledge your role as a participant observer, you'll have failed. And I had said to him that I couldn't bear the thought of including myself in the narrative because I couldn't stand the idea of writing a suburban Jewish kid from Cleveland goes to the res story. Like I couldn't imagine anything more boring than that, or more disgusting in some ways. But he intervened, as did other people who said, you have to do X or Y or Z. But in the end, the way that I dealt with all of it, and this is a writing strategy that I've employed for a very long time, is that I just said, I'm writing a book that I want my mom to be able to read. That's that when I think about voice, when I think about threading these kinds of needles, I just say, I want to write a book. We're back to me being the nice Jewish boy. Who I wasn't so nice, but who's just trying to make his mom reasonably happy. But I mean, my mom's a great target audience. She's incredibly well educated. She's incredibly smart, but she's not a trained historian. She doesn't know anything about historiography or care about it at all. She understands history as a transmission of stories. And so for me, it's a great way to think about these kinds of projects.
So did you go, help me with this, because I know the book and there's never and then at a particularly uncomfortable meeting, I was able to turn the tide. I mean, there's no I there who's getting in the way. So what was it that you did in response to Thomas's remark?
I rewrote the prologue and the epilogue, and then wrote a kind of an author's foreword, so that I situated myself in the story and made people aware that I understood the implications of my role as a participant observer, but also that I wasn't going to be one of the characters that readers would hear about, that I wouldn't be a through character in the story, because honestly, I just would have found that unbearable. I couldn't have written that book.
Right. And, but you're not denying your existence either, so.
Right. I mean, Thomas's point, and again, I'm using Thomas as a stand-in here for a number of people who made important interventions, which, if we don't spend a few minutes at least at some point in this conversation talking about craft, I think I'll be sad, because I'd like to hear both of you talk about the issue. But I mean, part of the historian's craft is to make sure that they're sharing their work prior to publication with smart, critical colleagues, and in some cases even with very sharp critics. And I've always benefited enormously from doing that. I wait until too late in the process to share my work because I'm too insecure to share it before I feel reasonably confident that it's ready for an audience. I would benefit by sharing work earlier, but I do share it at a point, usually when I'm at a penultimate draft. And in this case, I just had a number of people who said, you're obviously part of this story, and yet you don't acknowledge that. That's irresponsible. You are not fulfilling your obligations as a scholar by ignoring the reality that you were part of this story. And so I met them in the middle. I wasn't willing to rewrite the book in precisely the way that some people asked me to, but I did try and address their concerns.
Right. I think that's a really
And it-
important thing for younger scholars to hear, graduate students and students in general, that by the time a book is between covers, 100 or more sets of eyes have been on it. So when you're facing the blank screen writing your dissertation, don't think that you're writing anything like what, the books that are sitting on your shelf. You're writing a version that will turn into that over time, but don't think and don't mismeasure yourself by the distance that you see between what you're doing and the books on your shelf.
Right. Now,
I'm sorry, Patty.
I was going to follow up on his thought about craft, and
Please.
okay. So I have no idea, just as I had no idea how you picked sources for the first book. I cannot figure out what process or technology you use to organize the chapters, to design the chapters, and then to organize them, primarily because the shift between past and present, present and past and present, I'm doing that in daily life a lot, but I am just stunned by how smoothly that happens in these chapters. And we're struggling hard in the early 21st century, struggle. And then we're back and John Evans is sending out a proclamation. And I don't know. So I wonder, I know John McPhee has a wall and he puts Post-its on the wall and he moves them around. So I don't know if you have a wall with Post-its or a corkboard with push pins, or if you have a spreadsheet, or if you have an app that we must all find and use, or if it is just that your mind just never gets to rest and you have to keep, well, okay, so I think you know the answer and I clearly don't. How did you figure out how to organize that book?
Okay, so again, let me show some scaffolding here first. I wrote 5 complete drafts of the book, very different drafts. The original draft of the book was 2 separate stories. It was the Sand Creek story in the first half, and then in the second half, it was the memorialization story. I then read a huge amount about the cognitive neuroscience of memory and decided that I wanted to write a book about memory. And so I rewrote a draft that was that wrote about neuroscience, that wrote about the science of the brain and the way in which memory functions and dysfunctions.
Wow.
And I discovered in writing that second draft that I'm a terrible science writer, and that I to some extent I recapitulated experiences that I'd had with the New Orleans book, where I was writing so far outside of my comfort zone about fluvial tectonics and hydrographic features that that I didn't want to do that when the stakes were as high as they were for me and for others with the Sand Creek book. That I just I'm already, well, I can talk about the things that I got wrong in the Sand Creek book later. But so I then did a third draft where I removed all of that, but I tried to I tried to write in a way that would mimic the dysfunction of memory. That, in other words, the reader would move through the story and then they would arrive at a point at which there would be some kind of either a mnemonic or a landmark or a touchstone that would bring to bear a memory, which would then be caused to slip into the past. In that moment, I didn't skip a line even in paragraphs. I just wanted, and it was just, the book already asks too much of readers, but that was a bridge too far. People who read it said, what's wrong with you? Like we have no idea where we are in time and place. This is just unfair. And I mean, I won't go through all the other drafts, but that's that. But to answer your question, Patty, the penultimate and then ultimate drafts, what I did was I storyboarded the whole book because that's what I had done for Battle Lines. It's not nearly as advanced or as effective as McPhee's system, which, by the way, reading McPhee write about writing, I think is on the one hand absolutely fascinating, and I love it. But it's a little bit like listening to Michael Jordan talk about dunking a basketball, right? It's like, oh, that's cool that you can do that, but you're ignoring the fact that you have a 48-inch vertical jump. It's and you have gifts that are simply inaccessible to the rest of us, right? Like, I mean, or listening to Louis Armstrong in the very few moments where he talked about playing his horn, right? Where he would say that he would talk about what we all recognize as synesthesia, right? That he would see the music and smell it and taste it, right? It's like, oh, well, that's cool. How about for the rest of us who are, here kind of bound by the realities of being mortal? So for me, Immortal, I just sat down with literally every paragraph, and I created a template where I asked myself what was being said in the paragraph, who was appearing in the paragraph, why the people who were in the paragraph were there, should they be named or not named, and why that paragraph was either coming before or after the paragraph before it, or the next one in succession. It was a totally grueling way of doing this, but again, I had done this for Battle Lines, and it allowed me to visualize the book, which then gave me the opportunity to fundamentally rethink its structure, which I want to say to anyone who's listening to this, I didn't do a good enough job. The book is imbalanced, right? I don't have enough flashbacks. They're not distributed evenly enough. And so it demands a lot of the reader because they can't slip into a rhythm with the book. Now, I told myself at the time that was a conscious choice, and it was. It was a choice that I made because, again, I was thinking about how our memories function or really dysfunction all the time, and the way in which our memories structure our experience of reality, and how burdensome our memories are in many instances, how unproductive memory can be and productive in other instances. But it was a lazy choice. I should have been kinder to the reader, and I shouldn't have been so interested in my own parlor trick.
Well, I know that Patty's bad cop self is going to move us along as she should, but let me just make one observation on that, is just to say there's a difference between asymmetry and imbalance. And I would say the book is asymmetrical in a way that is actually quite productive, and that you're being quite harsh with yourself when you criticize the narrative structure the way you do. Because to me, as a reader, it's challenging, but it's also, it captures the kind of dimensionality that you want when you're talking about histories and collision, and the way that the differential memories then refract through time. And I think it's beautifully done myself.
Oh, and Matt certainly should have said that, and I'm glad he said it. He speaks for me on that. And we have 5 minutes remaining, and we have this extraordinary book, Battle Lines. And I had not realized until you were speaking of it that you were actually working on both at the same time. That you, oh, heaven's sake. Okay, this is one of those Duke Ellington, John McPhee moments of how you could have two projects, how a human cognition could hold those two things together. It's pretty, or no, maybe not together, but have them underway. So this is extraordinary. It's not just by you, it's by Jonathan Fetter-Boehm, and it is called Battle Lines, A Graphic History of the Civil War. And as I said, my first totally ill-informed, ridiculous thought was, oh, I'm not sure, should Ari have done this? It's such an incredibly serious and intense subject. And cartoons, are we going to have cartoons? So that was before I owned a copy, before I looked at anything. And now I do realize that the two of you working together, Jonathan and you, have found a way to just get past any form of self-protection that a reader might have, of thinking, well, just, I know the Civil War was very rough. I think I'll just turn these pages and I'll be the same person I was at the end. So I would like to hear how that happened. Obviously, I didn't see it coming, and I won't speak of certain sections. I'll speak very briefly of the section on the New York draft riots, and I was able to detach a tiny bit to think you are doing this triptych. You have the African American people, you have the middle class, or upper class, I'll buy you out of this military service people, and then you have the Irish. And I understand that the triptych left me drawn in a way that having those different groups visited at different times would not have done it. So there was one place where I could think, I know what's happening to me. I know that this triptych is really reaching me in a way that, but I don't know why I can't think of the 23rd Psalm without falling apart now. I don't totally know why that is, but that's just one of several moments where I thought, how did you two do this? How did you plan it together? How did you execute and implement it together? And with such a result.
You know, so the idea of the book was mine, but Jonathan's a genius. And if you've looked at his other work, or people have looked at his other work, he's just a towering intellect. And I kind of hitched my wagon to his horse, is what it comes down to. I didn't know how to write a graphic book. I didn't know what I was doing. He taught me. And then we just kept challenging each other. He would draw things and I would say, that looks too much like a caricature to me. It needs to be better. I would write something and he would say, you're forgetting that this is graphic form. Fewer words is better. You have to give me stage direction, right? You're writing a play here, not a novel. You need to tell me what the pictures, and then I'll try and do it. And then at a certain point, relatively early in our working relationship, I realized that he really was the co-author, that he wasn't the illustrator of the book. And so that's, he became co-author, which is only appropriate. In terms of the choices that we made, it's on the one hand, it's guided by my Civil War lectures. It's guided, you know, the book follows to some extent is shaped by the way that I teach the war. On the other hand, it was an effort to try and capture what I understood to be cutting edge historiography for a wide audience, including an audience that might include high school students or even middle school students. What we ended up with is a book that has a bunch of layers. So we don't have images on the screen right now, and I don't want to, you know, this is bad. It's bad radio when you start saying to people, but we have an image of there's a chapter about the so-called contraband controversy, which is the moment in which the Emancipation Proclamation hadn't been handed down yet, but there were all of these enslaved people who were crossing over Union lines, and then they were treated as enslaved people by the Union Army. They were given terrible work to do. And so we juxtaposed that with a speech from Frederick Douglass in which he talks about the necessity of radical change, and he talks about the importance of an earthquake. And so you juxtapose an image of enslaved people digging trenches for the Union Army with Frederick Douglass talking about the importance of an earthquake. Some readers are going to pick up what you're putting down, and they're going to say, "Oh, wow, I understand exactly." And other readers aren't, and that's okay. And that's the beauty of that form is that you can play with storytelling conventions and narrative conventions in ways that aren't generally accessible. Certainly would never be accessible to me because I can't draw. But aren't generally accessible to historians. And that's why historians who do work in documentary film, I think, often enjoy it, because it opens up ways of playing with narrative conventions.
Okay, so we are at the end of our time, and we are going to move very nimbly to a Zoom format where we can have more participation. And everyone should be able to see in the Q&A, you should be able to see the Zoom link that will take you over to where we are going to reconvene. So it is very terrible to not have more time to stay and just continue with this, but this is what we have, because we will be able to continue with us in this other format. And I'm just going to insert a minute and a half here, Ari, for you to answer one last question. It is a question that Matt has used in his interviews with others. what have you wanted to say to the world?
You mean with my work or what?
As a dean, I only wanted you to talk about being dean. No, no, just kidding.
Well, we need to realize synergies through maximized efficiencies brought about through metrically informed collaboration. No, I mean, the world doesn't need to hear anything that I have to say. I got into this line of work because insofar as I have things to say, I find that I am best able to express them through my writing. And again, Patty, I mean, you've just provided a wonderful opportunity for a very neat narrative arc. This idea of being a historian of mortality, it turns out that's exactly what I am. I want people to understand. I want people to understand the limits on what we can and can't know, and on what we can and can't achieve. And mortality is the ultimate limit, which is why I think it keeps coming up in my work. So, the Sand Creek book is really a meditation on epistemology. Again, I hate to sound fatuous, but you know me well enough to know that I am nothing if not fatuous. And really, it's just a meditation on what historians can't know. And on how challenging it is to be confronted with the limits of our discipline and what is and isn't knowable. And that if that's the thing that I convey to people, then I feel like I've succeeded. So am I supposed to leave? Am I supposed to end this Zoom meeting?
We're all, if this were a brick and mortar affair, we'd be moving into the adjoining room for snacks. We're moving into the adjoining room. We're gonna schmooze. We're gonna talk. People who haven't had a chance to ask questions can ask questions, and so it'll be a different format, but the same group. So thanks, everyone.
Sorry. That if we were going to have an in-person event, which we would now have our standing ovation.
Yes.
Before we get into our reception. So we're a little bit, if we stand up, we just look ridiculous on the Zoom screen, so we can't do that. So,
Okay.
So that was totally wonderful. And we are going to continue, and we should have clear links to that. If for some reason you are not finding your link, stay on, because as I understand it, one of our team members, Lisa, will be available to escort you, I guess, or direct you to where we have all gone. So thank you so much, and we'll see you all in a moment or two.
I'll see you in the parlor in just a moment.
In the parlor, right? Okay, bye-bye.